Welcome everyone to our Realizing Our Recharge Potential webinar today. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Ashley Boren, CEO of Sustainable Conservation, and with me today is Dr. Daniel Mountjoy, Sustainable Conservation's Director of Resource Stewardship and the lead for our Water for the Future program. For those of you who don't know us, Sustainable Conservation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping California thrive by uniting people to solve the toughest challenges facing our land, air, and water. That means every day we bring together business, landowners, scientists, government, water agencies, nonprofit, and others to advance collaborative solutions to steward the natural resources we all depend on in ways that are just and make economic sense. With the incredible storms we had at the start of the year and all the questions about why California was not capturing more of the floodwater, we thought we should kick off the year with a webinar about what is happening and the steps that can be taken to do even more as we adapt to climate change and our new reality of extremes, droughts, and deluges. Before we go further, though, we want to first get to know our audience. So we've got a couple of polls for you. Our first one has two questions. Where are you zooming in from today, and what is your affiliation? So take a minute to fill that out. Hannah, let me know when you think you've got enough. Great. So let's share those results. So it looks like we've got actually quite a great distribution across the state of folks joining in from all parts. And then also a really good diversity of backgrounds or experience from academic, agriculture, business, government, nonprofit, water agency, and other. And if your options aren't in the polls, feel free to put them in the chat. We have one more poll question for you just to gauge kind of level of knowledge about water in California and particularly, drought and flood management. Do you consider yourself an expert, average, or a beginner? Great. So again, it looks like we have a good mix. Definitely 24% of you that are experts. The most of you would kind of consider yourself average knowledge, and then about 25% of you are beginners. So that's actually just about a perfect bell curve. Let's see. This is our plan for the next hour. Since we do have some of you in the audience that are less familiar with water issues, I'm going to start out by briefly setting some context, and then I'm going to turn it over to Daniel to do three things. First, he's going to share what Sustainable Conservation and our partners have been doing for the past few weeks to spread out floodwater and let it sink into our underground aquifers. Second, he'll talk about what we will be collectively doing this year to prepare for potential future storms, and importantly, the spring melt of the incredible snowpack that is in the Sierra right now, and which could cause flooding. And then third, Daniel will talk about what needs to be put in place in future years to fully integrate flood and drought management. After that, we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So please feel free at any time to put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And after Daniel finishes with his comments, I'll tee up those questions and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Okay, so setting the context. As many of you know, California has the most volatile precipitation patterns of any state in the nation. Lately, it seems like we are either in extreme drought conditions or we are experiencing torrential rains and snow. And our hearts go out to those who have suffered loss of life and property these past few weeks. California's volatile weather happens not only between years, but as we've seen this year, it happens within years. As this graph illustrates, there really is no such thing as a normal year of precipitation in California. We either have significantly under or over the average precipitation. This graph runs from 1896 to 2017, and you can see in the latter years that volatility is increasing. This points to the trend we are in, which is more frequent and intense droughts, punctuated by very wet years and torrential downfall like we experienced in late December and early January. The water infrastructure we built in California in the 1930s through the 1960s was designed to move water from reservoirs, primarily in the northern part of the state, to cities and farms in the middle and southern parts of the state. During this time, we also built flood infrastructure designed to protect cities and farms and to generally move floodwater out to sea as quickly as possible to avoid flood damage. The LA River is perhaps the most illustrative example of this kind of flood control. Until relatively recently, we have thought about floodwater separately from groundwater, just as we have thought of surface water in reservoirs and rivers separately from groundwater. Both our infrastructure and our thinking need to be updated to the 21st century and the more extreme weather we are experiencing and will continue to experience even more dramatically. Fortunately, there are many in California that recognize the need to better integrate flood and drought management. And while we still have a ways to go to scale a more integrated approach to water management, there is a lot of good work happening. There was a lot of great media coverage these past few weeks about the need to let our rivers have more room to slow them down, allow their waters to spread out and sink into the ground while also providing good habitat for fish and wildlife. The Department of Water Resources and a number of conservation organizations are working on this strategy, and great examples are the Yolo Bypass near Sacramento, pictured here, and the Dos Rios project at the confluence of the Tuolumne and San Joaquin rivers, which the nonprofit River Partners created and is now California's newest state park. We need more of these kinds of projects. Sustainable conservation is working to support efforts to reconnect rivers to their floodplains. We also know, especially in the shorter term, that to address flood risk and take advantage of high flow events, we need to think more expansively and divert flood flows more broadly, including onto active and fallow farmland. We believe using farmland in this way is a critical strategy for reducing flood risk and damage like we saw last month, as well as for recharging aquifers to prepare us for the inevitable future droughts. Sustainable conservation was introduced to this concept of using farmland to recharge groundwater by Don Cameron, a farmer in Fresno County who's entirely dependent on groundwater for his water supply. We partnered with him and scientist Phil Bichon in 2011, a big water year for California. Don took flood flows from the Kings River and allowed them to spread out over his grape, almond, and alfalfa fields, all on very sandy soils that are good for percolation. He was able to recharge a lot of groundwater with no impact to the health or yield of his crops. With hundreds of thousands of acres with sandy soils and big water years every 3 to 7 years, we realized that his approach had a lot of potential in the San Joaquin Valley. So for the past 12 years, we've been partnering with growers, irrigation districts, and most recently, the Department of Water Resources to advance this strategy, which means a lot of preparing and planning in drought years so we can be ready for wet years. So fast forward to 2017 and then 2019, California's next big water years after 2011, and we and our partners have collectively made strong progress. In 2019, more than 300 farmers were accepting floodwater on their land for the purpose of recharging groundwater. Sustainable conservation was actively working with 6 water agencies on our groundwater recharge assessment tool, a web-based geospatial tool we developed with the Earth Genome. This decision support tool amasses information about soil type, underlying geology, crops, and water conveyance to allow water agencies to determine how to optimize groundwater recharge in their districts. And perhaps most importantly, in 2019, we also began partnering closely with the Department of Water Resources on their FloodMAR program. FloodMAR, which stands for Flood Managed Aquifer Recharge, is advancing the concept of integrating flood and drought management by thinking about many of the pieces from the top of the watershed to the bottom, as illustrated in this graphic. So from reoperating reservoirs to enable more groundwater recharge, to using flood bypasses and floodplains, as well as other natural and working lands to spread water out during high flow events so it can sink into our groundwater aquifers where it can support communities, farming, and the environment in times of drought. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel, who will talk with you about the recharge that is happening now, what sustainable conservation and our partners are doing the next few months and this year to prepare us for possible future storms and snowmelt. And then importantly, what we can learn from this year and what we can all do in the coming years to better prepare us for big water years and floods. Because while we have made some progress, there is a lot of work to do to scale this integrated approach to flood and drought management. So Daniel, over to you.
Thank you, Ashley. And is my screen visible now?
Yes.
Great. So thank you for that introduction. And we really are at a point now where public awareness of flooding following 3 years of water scarcity is really high. Many have suffered significant loss because of the flood impacts that we've been seeing. And however, the fact that flooding followed so quickly after drought has helped Californians realize that floodwaters are in fact a resource. Numerous headlines have pointed out that the state does not appear to be prepared to capture sufficient runoff in years when we have a surplus. Reservoirs are one way that the state is capturing water, and that we've been storing water, a lot of water, in the past month. These figures from the Department of Water Resources show us that as of December 31st, on the left-hand side of the screen, very few of the state's reservoirs had even achieved their historic average levels, shown with the green lines on each of those reservoir storage levels. But as of the end of January, on the right, many reservoirs have filled to their historic average, and flood releases began on some over the past few weeks in January. The atmospheric rivers have been centered primarily on the mid-Sierra region of the state, so you notice that the reservoirs in that region filled first, which then initiated flood releases to prepare space for future storms and snowmelt. And those irrigation districts that rely on those reservoir flood releases can then use their irrigation canals to convey that water to farmland and recharge basins within their districts to start implementing recharge. And despite the intensity of rains and local flooding that many of us experienced, recharge was actually not possible until recently. Really, the second week of January is when it really started to become feasible in some locations. Groundwater recharge offers the cheapest and most readily available form of water storage with a capacity that far exceeds our surface water reservoirs as much as threefold, according to the Public Policy Institute of California. And groundwater recharge is happening. We're happy to report. It's happening across every natural landscape where rain falls. It's happening through the bottom of streams, rivers, and lakes. But managed aquifer recharge is the key, we think, to capturing infrequent but larger storm events. This is the year sustainable conservation and many of our state and local partners have been preparing for. As Ashley said, we have been expanding our relationships with farmers and irrigation districts across the San Joaquin Valley for more than 10 years. As a result of earlier demonstrations, projects, field trials with farmers, and our partners at the Almond Board of California and UC Davis and others, the concept of on-farm recharge has been gaining acceptance. In locations where water districts, landowners, and farmers were prepared this year, we're seeing expanded private land recharge that is replenishing our depleted groundwater aquifers. These maps show where we're tracking on-farm recharge that is happening right now. On the left, many districts, and I should say that in addition to these places we're tracking, many other districts are actually using recharge basins and encouraging farmers to take water. These are just the ones that we've been partnering with. You'll see that our focus has been in the San Joaquin Valley, where groundwater overdraft is most severe. And we've worked with 5 irrigation districts and GSAs, shown in the lower left, to develop recharge programs over the last couple of years. 2 of those districts we've been working with for over 8 years, the Madera Irrigation District and the Madera Irrigation District and the Tulare Irrigation District. They are implementing district-wide recharge programs that I'll discuss in more detail in a minute. 3 other districts are supporting demonstration projects by providing water to select growers to gain experience and build interest in recharge within their districts. And these are in the Turlock Irrigation District, Merced Irrigation District, and North San Joaquin Irrigation District, which is actually off this map. And on the right, we've prepared a few other dispersed growers to do recharge when water is available to demonstrate the concept in an expanded number of counties. So how did we get to the point of having locations ready to recharge this year? Well, we've been working on the ground with those farmers and districts to build experience and prepare for recharge. It takes time to establish trust and relationships, and it takes time to support existing district partners to build the momentum to change established farming and water district management methods. We've done this through grower workshops with groups of growers in districts. We've done field trips and field days to the demonstration sites. And we've worked with the Almond Board of California to address growers' concerns and provide guidance about how to avoid crop health issues. And we work with local pest control and certified crop advisors to be sure that they're familiar with the risks and benefits to crops so that when growers approach them, they're prepared to answer questions. And we've collaborated to create incentives. NRCS of the US Department of Agriculture has for the first time created a cost share practice program to reward farmers for doing on-farm recharge and building basins on their lands to capture water. And 20 growers are part of this first new test of Farm Bill funding. So I want to talk about a couple of the districts where their recharge programs are in full tilt right now. In Madera Irrigation District, they're in their third year of a district-wide recharge program that began in 2017 and in 2019 when we again had water. Growers this year are being offered water at a subsidized rate, and they expect to recharge more than 9,000 acre feet, or I should say more than the 9,000 acre feet that they accomplished in 2019. In fact, since the second week of January, 170 growers have signed up with multiple fields, and more than 8,000 acre feet have already been applied for recharge. And that's in addition to a lot of rainfall that has fallen on those same fields, which we were concerned could dampen farmer interest in taking additional water. But growers now are much more aware of their SGMA, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act requirements and the need to replenish their groundwater aquifer, and are taking on more water than we've seen in the past. In addition, 18 farm sites in Madera County will also receive the NRCS cost share funding program I just mentioned as an added incentive to apply available water on their fields or in their private recharge basins. The Tulare Irrigation District is also in its third year of their recharge program, and they're filling canals and recharge basins, and then are making water available to more than 85 fields currently, including fallow lands and pistachios. They've also created an incentive system that gives growers credit for applying excess irrigation water in the winter towards their summer pumping allocation. All of this is now tracked in their water dashboard tool that keeps track of pumping levels as well as recharge levels so that growers know how they're doing towards their annual allocation of groundwater. And according to the most recent updates from Aaron at Tulare Irrigation District, they're delivering more than twice as much water now than they have in the past, with 1,500 acre feet of water being applied every day. And that's again since early January. We've also been supporting farmers to establish demonstration projects to build wider grower awareness and also build water district interest. On the Costa Vineyard in northern San Joaquin County, in the North San Joaquin Water District, the district is paying to pump the water onto this demonstration site. In 2019, you can see images here of the water being applied. But in fact, in 3 weeks already this year, 9 feet of water have been applied on this vineyard. 9 feet of water is equivalent to storing 3 years worth of the water needs for this crop. And that essentially stores it for future pumping out of that aquifer. The Department of Water Resources has been funding us to expand these pilot projects elsewhere in the state to help recruit, plan, and implement and document on-farm recharge. Some of these project sites are located in the Turlock Irrigation District, where the district has been collaborating to help identify sites for recharge. 3 almond growers have been taking water since early January, actually even prior to that from some of the canal residual water. And these are all on almond orchards, which is an important crop to be able to demonstrate recharge, because many almond growers were initially concerned with the concept of putting water on their trees. But in partnership with the Almond Board of California and researchers at UC Davis, they were able to demonstrate that wintertime recharge when the trees are dormant did not cause any damage to the trees or to yields. These fields in Turlock, as of about a week ago, it applied a little more than 1 foot 2 inches of water. And a lot of lessons are being learned by both the farmers there as well as the district, and it helps us all understand some of the challenges to why perhaps not more water has been taken this year. One is the need for managing canals during the winter, when most irrigation districts have them shut down for winter canal maintenance, and also the need to bring back on staff to deliver water out to these fields when there's an interest from growers to take that water. This is a staffing and district management changes that have to be made in order to accommodate more expansive groundwater recharge. So now that the storms are over, have we missed an opportunity to do more recharge this year? Flood releases are starting to slow down from some of the reservoirs since it's been dry for the last couple of weeks now. And the dormant season is going to end soon for many of the tree crops, which reduces the compatibility for taking water. But with snowpack at 205% of normal for this time of year, many areas of the state are in good shape for having an average water supply. But that's only if the snowpack melts gradually into the reservoirs for distribution to farms and cities. If, however, we get an early hot spell or warm rains, the snow can melt quickly and reservoirs, I'm sorry, that was the reservoirs could melt quickly and reservoirs would have to release stored water to manage flooding. We see an opportunity to be prepared right now for these potential spring releases. This is the time for those that are thinking, why didn't we act during the winter when the flows were available, to prepare now for a spring flood release, so they don't ask themselves again, why weren't we prepared in the springtime when the water was released? We recently met with the Almond Board California and are working with them to get this message out. Now is the time to identify where there are suitable fields, in many cases unplanted fields or fields where trees were taken out due to the drought, and prepare those fields with a berm around those fields to hold 6 inches of water when the water does become available. And it's time right now to talk with irrigation districts about planning and encouraging other farmers to take water on either fallow fields or suitable cropland when that water might become available. Because we need to be ready in the spring. Now is the time to be making those preparations. So what's needed to prepare California to integrate flood and drought management in future years? Well, there's a lot to be done. The FloodMar approach offers an excellent roadmap. And we've been focusing in this discussion so far on farmland recharge, but I want to take a minute to also highlight the importance of floodplains, along with other strategies indicated in this image. While the memory of flooding is fresh in our minds, consider the importance of expanding floodplains along rivers, but not just along major rivers, but the smaller local streams where a lot of the flood damage actually occurred this year. With increased rainfall intensity from atmospheric rivers, we need more space for flood mitigation. And it will also provide habitat enhancement and recharge if those expanded areas are designed for multiple benefits. As many of you know, sustainable conservation has been leading the effort to simplify the permitting process for aquatic habitat restoration projects. And those permits can be applied to these floodplain expansion opportunities that we hope we'll be seeing more of. So we're at a watershed moment with the opportunity to advance and scale FloodMar, and we recommend focusing on 4 strategies to move this forward. The first one is advancing the science for what's possible, so we know exactly what is possible and how can we do it without causing harm. We'll also talk about identifying local recharge opportunities, targeting recharge to communities and ecosystems, benefits, and considering water quality. But first, in terms of science, at Sustainable Conservation, we worked with the Earth Genome, another nonprofit, to develop the groundwater recharge assessment tool. And this tool was developed to help identify recharge potential across landscapes served by irrigation district canal systems. And we've partnered with the Department of Water Resources to expand this tool in conjunction with climate modeling and groundwater models to get a better picture of what's possible using the best available scientific information. In this tool, we take information about site suitability, including soils and geology, as well as crop compatibility in terms of the crop's suitability and timing through the year, and rank all the fields in the district. The Department of Water Resources is then able to provide us with climate and runoff models to predict the daily water available for recharge that would enter down the rivers and into these irrigation districts' canal systems. Within GRAT, we then evaluate the daily canal bottlenecks throughout the system to determine where can we move that water and can we get it to these fields that are best suited for recharge. So when the tool then picks on a daily basis the best fields and applies that available water within the constraints of the canal system to determine how much recharge is done on a monthly basis on those fields. And that information then is transferred to groundwater models to determine where that water ends up going ultimately. Any water that can't be applied on fields due to the restrictions or limitations is then considered unused water for recharge. It's really cannot be diverted from the river and remains a risk for climate and downstream flood management. We took this approach to the Merced watershed and applied it with the DWR partners to evaluate what is the potential of recharge within that district. And what we found is without adding any structural changes, we can use just existing conveyance plus on-farm recharge as well as canals and a few recharge basins, that it's possible over the future years to, on average, recharge 31% of the average annual overdraft. And if we start to look at reservoir management as a way to adjust and release water prior to storm occurrences, we can actually capture more of that water, better prepare for flood control, and recharge up to 46% of the average annual overdraft. And then finally, if we were to also explore the idea of conveyance expansion in floodplains, as well as the other two practices, we can get up to addressing 63% of the average annual overdraft. These are critical results because if those overdraft levels are not reduced through supply enhancement such as this, those have to be met by pumping restrictions. The other thing with the climate change models is that on the Merced River, there's a projected 6-fold increase in flood peaks. And the amount of water that is able to be diverted off using these approaches would actually reduce those projected increases by 65%. It's still an increase in flood risk, but it's much less significant when you combine it with managing for recharge and using those aquifers as water storage, both for water supply, but also for flood management. The Department of Water Resources is working now to expand these studies throughout the San Joaquin River watersheds, as shown in this image in blue. And we're working with them and others to model the rivers in this region. And the department also wants to go beyond and to apply this approach in a much larger area of the Central Valley, where snowmelt changes with climate change pose significant flood risks and offer significant recharge benefits. And we're very supportive of this approach. The second strategy going forward is around identifying recharge opportunities. And much as I discussed earlier about preparing for winter snowmelt this year, this is work that needs to be begun throughout the valley, throughout the regions where there are opportunities. Flood marsh solutions are distinctly local and have to be worked out on a local basis. As a part of those 5 watersheds on the San Joaquin River, we're meeting with 5 districts we've not previously worked with to identify their recharge opportunities, identify their existing and planned water conveyance systems, and look at their groundwater sustainability plan ideas and see if there's ways to increase the potential for those projects to improve recharge. Many districts have not recognized the value of farmland to capture peak flows and have primarily focused on recharge basins. But we've been able to show both on the ground and through modeling that on-farm recharge can more than double the recharge capacity of existing recharge basins in districts. Also, the FloodMar network has been established through a variety of academics and agency folks, as well as practitioners, and it provides opportunities for various linkages between researchers, technical consultants, NGOs, and water managers. And we'll provide information at the end about how to become part of the network. As we think about recharge, we've really started to refine our thinking from simply trying to capture as much water as possible to thinking about how can recharge be used to address a variety of groundwater concerns. Specifically, where can recharge be done that's not just based on site suitability, but also shaped by where's the best outcome. One of those examples is thinking about our critically overdrafted basins and where there are wells that are at risk of going dry, especially in disadvantaged communities outlined here in red within the Merced subbasin or within the Merced irrigation district. And we're able to identify in blue the fields where recharge would have the most direct benefit for those drinking water wells to avoid them from being drying up if we were to recharge in other parts of the district. So when there's only limited amount of water available in some years, recharging on these fields could have the greatest benefit to protect drinking water supply. Similarly, identifying fields where recharge would enhance groundwater dependent ecosystems or stream flows or wildlife habitat is another strategy that can be used to target recharge to areas that achieve the greatest benefit for multiple functions. And then finally, water quality. Many have raised the concern that recharge has the potential to improve groundwater quantity, but what will it do for groundwater quality? Well, it can dilute nitrates and salts if it's focused in specific areas, or it can unintentionally flush legacy pollutants into drinking water supplies. Groundwater dependent communities need to be involved in these decisions about where recharge occurs, because there are real trade-offs between having water at all and having water that may have degraded quality for a short term before enough water is applied to start to dilute it. And those communities need to be part of that decision. And there needs to be more science available to determine how much water is needed to determine if that is in fact a risk. So as the interest in recharge grows, new challenges are emerging that require science and collaboration to address them. Here are three that we hear about every day. One of the largest challenges to capturing more stormwater for recharge is our complex system of water rights and how that affects the incentives for private landowners to recharge the aquifer. Some districts don't have winter water diversion permits at all, so they can't divert these flood flows that we're seeing off the river. Those districts that do have permits or authority to divert water can incentivize growers to do recharging of that water, because they can then get credit towards their future water use. Another option is local flood managers can declare a flood risk to life and property and authorize diversion of peak flows, but the water can't be used for intentional recharge to be pumped later. In those cases, the personal incentive for private landowners to take the water on their land is therefore low, unless there are other public incentives to reward the long-term benefit of mitigating flood impacts and replenishing groundwater incidentally. But currently obtaining new water rights permits is a complex process and seeks to ensure that fish and wildlife and downstream users and other conditions are not impacted while providing water for beneficial uses. The State Water Board has created some new alternative processes for applying for temporary water permits, either on a 180-day basis or for 5 years, that would allow for recharge of flood water that can later be pumped for agricultural and other uses. And those then again create the incentive for farmers to take that water. And we're currently evaluating how that application process is working and how the state could further expedite the process of obtaining those permits. One way to expedite the application process would be for the state to conduct watershed scale water availability analyses and functional flow analyses to protect ecosystems along these river systems so that all potential rechargers and diverters could make use of the same data in their applications. Right now, each applicant has to work on this on their own, and it's a very costly process. Installation of new stream gauges is another necessary improvement that's going to be needed to improve decision making. And finally, as demonstrated in the Merced Floodmar study, reservoir management changes can play a significant role in mitigating flooding and expanding recharge potential. The success of this approach requires coordination across resource agencies and negotiation across different management objectives that each of those agencies was set up to protect or manage. So there's growing interest in this approach to reintegrate our water systems, because water doesn't pay attention to these agency boundaries. And we now need to pay attention to the way water flows. So let's use this year to recognize the recharge potential demonstrated by the irrigation districts and individual farmers that have prepared and are doing recharge right now, and prepare ourselves to be ready for the spring snowmelt and for future year water. And I will now turn it over to Ashley to take us to the next step.
Thanks. Yeah, well, let's go to questions now from our webinar attendees. I see we have a number in the Q&A, and I just want to remind folks, if you can go to that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and then maybe Daniel, you can stop sharing now, I think. So let's see what we have. Let's see, first up, I see, hi, I'm a grower in the Northern San Joaquin Valley and would like to participate in a farmland groundwater recharge project. What is the best way to go about doing this? Actually, at the end of this webinar, we're going to put up a screen with different people to contact, including at Sustainable Conservation and Floodmar. So look for that. We'll also follow up with that information in an email after the webinar. So we'll definitely get resources to you. Let's see, another question from comment and question from Kenneth Johnson. Oops, just flipped out of my site. Very impressive program to optimize existing and expanded distribution to increase recharge. In addition to groundwater modeling, have you developed groundwater monitoring programs to collect data supporting the effect of recharge to date? Much of the overdraft is coming from wells below the Corcoran clay, and recharge would presumably take much longer to reach these depths. Any impacts observed? So, Daniel, I'm going to give you that question.
Sure. In terms of actual groundwater monitoring, we only have one site where we've done some of that. It was the vineyard site I talked about in San Joaquin County, where the vineyard was located very close to the river where the water was being pumped off of. And there was concern that does all this recharge just go back into the river? And so the district was able to set up a monitoring field of existing wells surrounding this vineyard. And what they actually found was groundwater levels came up further away from the river than they did close to the river. And that was because of the groundwater pumping gradient further from the river was much deeper. And so the water that was recharged flowed towards that deeper cone of depression where the pumping had been occurring. So we were pleased to see those results. As for below the Corcoran clay, that's going to take some time to see what the impacts would be. In the Floodmar models that we're working on with the Department of Water Resources, the groundwater models are, in fact, looking at that very issue. There's a lot of interest right now, we're starting to hear, on recharge above the Corcoran clay and perhaps shifting pumping from wells that are perforate, that go through the Corcoran clay to those deeper aquifers that are being depleted. And if we can recharge on top, shift to shallower wells above that level. But we don't have any empirical results yet on the really limited scale that these recharge efforts have been occurring on at this point. Though I think some of the district projects should start to demonstrate some results.
Great. We've got a couple related to water quality. One is, what are your thoughts on addressing concerns regarding water quality? You touched on that a bit, Daniel. Maybe you can elaborate a little more. And then related to that, there's a question that says, does conducting recharge on farmland versus conducting recharge in recharge basins have additional risk of negative water quality impacts? Oh, you're on mute, Daniel.
Thank you. Great questions. We did develop a water quality considerations white paper last year that addresses some of these concerns. The risk of water quality contamination by recharge on farmland is a function of a couple of different factors. Current nutrient management on the surface, in the surface soils of the farm, those absolutely have to be managed efficiently so that the crop is taking up those nutrients. But a bigger concern is the legacy loading of nutrients in the soil below the farm that might have accumulated over decades. And whether those nutrients are still there or if they've already been flushed into the groundwater, which is the third piece, is what's the quality of the groundwater today? And our risk analysis says you really need to consider all three of those. You can manage the top piece, and you can manage how much water you put on a site if there's anticipation that there's some legacy load there that needs to be diluted. So our basic recommendation is it's better to put a lot of water on one field over time, keep applying it on that field to ensure that you have dilution of whatever legacy load there was, than to spread a little bit of water everywhere with the risk of potentially leaching smaller amounts with less dilution volume. Recharge basins avoid that first factor of what's the current management, but they're still subject to what's the legacy loading below them. But the benefit is you put a lot of water on the same place year after year. So they do provide a good benefit for water quality, but they cost money to buy and build.
And I would just add, I don't think it's an either or strategy. I think it's a both and. Those recharge basins are great and have been important sites for recharge for decades. But when we get these really high peak flows, we're going to need additional land. Here's another question, Daniel, from Daniel Hoffman. Curious if you have seen this article about paleo valleys and its potential for targeted aquifer recharge. If so, are you incorporating this into any future plans or projects? And really great what you are all doing, what you're doing.
Yeah, paleo valleys are a really exciting opportunity, and there's a lot of interest right now in the state. The Department of Water Resources has just recently flown aerial electromagnetic imaging of the entire Central Valley to start to identify where some of these paleo valleys exist. And for those that haven't heard this term, paleo valleys are old river valleys that came down out of the Sierra Nevada and flowed down towards the Central Valley before the sediments that now cover them was in place. And many of those valleys got filled with coarse gravel and rock material and essentially offer a direct groundwater pathway for water to move under some of our clay layers and to refill the aquifers. And there's a lot of interest in identifying where they are so that we can prioritize recharge on top of them, where there's connectivity through other sands and gravels. And in fact, on the flood marsh studies that we're doing right now, we're engaged working with consultants at Woodard and Curran, who are interpreting those aerial electromagnetic images to try and identify where those are and build them into our site suitability ranking for fields. So yes, it's definitely a hot topic right now.
Yeah, and exciting. We've got a lot of questions. We're going to get to as many of these as we can. Is there, this one's from Daniel Gaiman, is there a seminal current study that defines root zone impacts for specific crops and specific periods of time? I think there is some negative impact misinformation out there still.
This is a body of knowledge that is not well developed. The work I mentioned earlier from UC Davis was some of the first work really looking at recharge and the effect of recharge. I think there's also a possibility to look at a lot of the irrigation water loading in soils to understand recharge doesn't have to be covering a field for a month at a time. It can be applied much more like just an over irrigation event and not represent a risk to root zones. We're using a variety of data that we looked at in a number of different literature around not just crops, but other plants, showing that a 75% soil saturation is probably your upper limit you want to get to, because you start to deplete the oxygen in the root zone, which then is a risk to root respiration. So, but that definitely is an area of needed work, and the Floodmar network identified that as an area of additional need. So folks working with Helen Dahlke and Astrid Boulder at UC Davis are really leading that kind of work.
Great. There's another one from an anonymous attendee. How does sustainable conservation see water service companies, so well drillers, pump companies, et cetera, playing a part in aquifer groundwater recharge through implementation of recharge wells, monitoring wells, construction of efficient irrigation systems?
It's a good question. We haven't worked so much with them. I mean, first, the efficient irrigation systems is a key piece. We really need to be thinking about recharge during wet years and efficient irrigation during dry years if we're going to bring our groundwater systems into balance. So thoroughly support irrigation efficiency. And the almond industry that we've been working with, they've done a lot to improve water efficiency. Now they're working on the recharge side of it, and setting up fields to have both capacities is an important role that irrigation companies can play, and funders as well. There's a lot of state and federal funding right now for irrigation efficiency, and we don't want to see farmers remove their quote inefficient flood systems in the name of drought water management, when in fact those flood application systems are how we get water on the fields when we have abundant water. So designing systems for both purposes is really critical. And then the well monitoring is an interesting question, whether wells can be set up to be more efficiently used for monitoring, so that growers can actually notice and track their own benefits locally from their recharge efforts.
Yeah, interesting idea. Another question from an anonymous attendee: which groundwater model or models are you utilizing for your analyses?
So sustainable conservation is not doing the modeling ourselves. The DWR team that's working on these studies is doing that. And it's a variety of modified C2 VSIM. I am not a groundwater modeler, so I'm going to actually, if somebody's on the line that's doing that, maybe they can put it into chat which models are being used.
Great. So this is from Kurt Schwabe. Excuse me if I didn't pronounce your last name correctly. I'm not sure if I heard this in your discussion of water rights, but do you sense there may be some entities making claims on any excess flood flows that you'd plan on capturing and diverting with better reservoir management and conveyance to Floodmar sites that might limit the success of this?
Let me make sure I follow this.
Yeah. That's a hard one to answer, I think.
I think what you're raising, Kurt, is the question of, is someone currently using some of those flows that that new diversion for recharge might divert, and that is the subject of water rights permitting, is to evaluate existing water rights and claims to that water and determine if new requests for that water are in fact going to impair not only the environmental flows and uses of that water, but downstream water users. Better reservoir management, the goal for that is to avoid gigantic peak discharges caused by a sudden snowmelt event that far exceeds anyone's capacity to take it. And then the PPIC just recently did a blog talking about the amount of water coming down the rivers and the very limited amount of diversion capacity that actually exists in the state system to divert that water when it comes in such large events. So reservoir reoperation is really designed to release it in a slower manner so that all those water rights holders and the environment can better make use of it and not all stand back and without any ability to capture it.
Great. This one's from Elliot Matchett. What research is being conducted to evaluate ecosystem benefits? So for waterfowl and shorebirds of recharge efforts, is there funding for this? Has the basin characterization model, BCM by USGS, also been used to account for or plan for recharge? Perhaps another option for you to consider.
Yeah, so the Nature Conservancy is doing some great work with the Department of Water Resources on this very topic of waterfowl and shorebirds, especially on recharge sites in the Sacramento Valley, areas that don't have the same pressure in terms of overdraft, though that is growing in that region. And so they've been looking at it. And as I showed in the one slide about ecosystem benefits and targeting recharge for it, in the floodmar studies that we're doing with the department for the 5 tributaries to the San Joaquin River, we are identifying shorebird habitat that needs to be wetted up at critical times of year during the migratory flyway period. And those fields oftentimes are not the same fields that are best suited for recharge, because you actually want water to stand in those fields. Yes, there will be some recharge from them, but that goes back to the idea of defining what the objectives are with this sort of broader integrated water management approach, and reserving some water to put for those flyway migratory bird habitat. And I'm not familiar with how the basin characterization model is doing that, but sounds like something we should look at. Thanks, Elliot.
We had a couple questions related to urban. I'll do both of them. Well, you probably asked you can try to address them separately. Let's see. The first one is this is from Judy DeFreitas. Hi, Judy. Eventually, will urban communities in the San Joaquin Valley be able to participate in capturing water? I know flooding in urban settings carries with it contaminants as homes and cars are flooded. And then thanks for holding this talk. Any comments on urban stormwater capture, Daniel?
Yeah, great question. So urban areas already, as you point out, capture all this flood water off of these impervious surfaces and either put them in their own recharge basins or flood mitigation ponds, or when those are exceeded, then pump them out, oftentimes into irrigation canals from irrigation districts that conjunctively manage that flood water with the cities. And that is, in fact, I guess a new source of floodwater. Some of the projects, the pilot projects that are out there right now that we're aware of, are in fact fed by urban water runoff as well as small stream runoff. So that is certainly an issue, an area. I think many cities, of course, are trying to build their own infiltration ponds and recharge facilities to capture as much of that as they can. The other flip side of this is in Merced, where I showed the picture of the flooding. A lot of the urban flooding comes from streams upslope from the cities, where large storm events exceed the capacity of those channels to carry the water and spills out, oftentimes causing harm in the cities. One of the things we look at is, are there places upstream of the city where there's good on-farm recharge locations, or where those channels should be widened so that you can have recharge or floodplain adjacent to the streams to slow that flow and capture it before it hits the city limit. So those are all definitely issues that are being explored in these studies.
Great. These are such great questions, everyone. We're not going to get to all of them. Some of them we'll try to get back to you on individually, but Daniel, I'm going to give you one more and then we'll wrap up. This is from Bill Mitchell. Sorry if I missed this. What's the estimated number of acres that have adopted groundwater recharge practices, and what's a reasonable target for acreage over the next 5 years?
Yeah, we don't know the total sum of all acres being recharged. I would have to actually add it up from all of the separate pilot projects that we know. It's not a large number at this point, except in Madera and Tulare Irrigation District. I would say those are the two largest acreages. The Department of Water Resources has set a target of, let's see, this is acres or?
It was acres.
Acres, yeah. know that the total, haven't seen a target for acres. What we do know is that probably 500,000 acres to 1 million acres of land is likely to go out of production in the San Joaquin Valley as a result of achieving compliance with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So there's a lot of acres available. In the Merced study, we found that all the available recharge could be recharged on only a portion of the available lands. There was always more land available than was needed. And especially if we focus that water on repeated recharge on the same acres, it's not as much. But that's something that we're working with districts to help them prepare, to think about how many folks do you need to line up and have ready in your localized condition.
I think another way to maybe think about that question, Bill, is also what's the potential, and the Public Policy of Institute of California has done some extensive studies looking at kind of all possibilities around recharge, and they think it could address about 25% of the overdraft problem in the San Joaquin Valley. So it's not going to solve everything. Pumping restrictions will be required as well, but it's definitely a very important part of the solution. So with that, I think I'm going to close up. Thank you all again for joining us today. We hope you're leaving this webinar with an understanding of what's happening now, and importantly, what's possible by moving to a more integrated approach to flood and drought management, and the importance of preparing in advance for atmospheric rivers like we saw in December and January. Sustainable Conservation is expanding its efforts to realize the potential of this approach with our Watershed Moment initiative, and we'd love to engage you in our efforts. So we're going to follow up with the information on this slide in an email to you. But if you're a grower interested in exploring whether your property is appropriate for groundwater recharge, please contact our agronomist, Rochelle Rogers at Sustainable Conservation. If you're a water agency interested in developing a program that encourages on-farm recharge, please contact Water Resources Project Director Joe Chaparena, also at Sustainable Conservation. If you're interested in engaging in the conversation and efforts surrounding FloodMar, please join the FloodMar network by emailing Supervising Engineer Jenny Marr at the Department of Water Resources. The network holds monthly information sharing and discussion sessions. And if you're interested in supporting Sustainable Conservation's Watershed Moment initiative, please contact our Chief Development Officer, Michael Behrens at Sustainable Conservation. We're going to add all of your emails to our e-newsletter list so you can keep apprised of our work, but please also follow us on Twitter at suscon_CA for more real-time updates. And that's it. Thank you all.